Great. Okay. Well, hope you guys are ready for round two. We have 9 illustrious people you're going to hear from. I'm just the person who says the names. And so we'll start with. Well, I'm going to introduce Kirti. First of all, Dr. Gupta is the Vice President and Chief Economist of Global Technology at Cornerstone. She's the session discussant. Dr. Gupta is an engineer and economist specializing in technology, IP, including issues such as SEP, Standard Essential Patents, FRAND licensing, and antitrust. Before joining Cornerstone, Dr. Gupta was the Vice President and Chief Economist at Qualcomm, global leader in mobile communications. We all know Qualcomm, and it's a very cool job. She's now a hired gun who addresses class certification, breach of contract, licensing, and other issues in the antitrust context primarily. That you'll hear from her later. Our first presenter today is Tianxin Zhao at the University of Florida, Warrington College of Business. Professor Zhao's research focuses on quantitative marketing and applied game theory. His research investigates how new technologies and business models on the internet will reshape firm strategies and consumer welfare. And then we have as our discussant, Professor Anthony Dukes. Professor Dukes focuses on marketing intermediaries, the businesses that connect marketers to their customers, such as retailers, e-commerce platforms, and commercial content sites. Professor Dukes is also the co-director with Professor Sokol on the Initiative on Digital Competition and was a senior editor at the Journal of Marketing Science. And with that, I'll turn it over to you to Dr. Zhao. Professor Zhao.
Okay, thank you, Jane, for the introduction. And I want to start by thanking Danny and Jennifer for organizing this wonderful conference and everybody together here. So the paper I'm going to present today is actually about, this is an antitrust conference, and the paper I'm going to present is about a very prevalent self-preferencing antitrust legal called self-preferencing, and we are focusing in the context of the add-on market. So to give you an example, so by the way, this is a collaboration with Jane Gu and Xinxin Li from University of Connecticut. So to give you a concrete example about the add-on market, so let's think about Apple. So Apple not only make profit from selling the devices, the hardware-based product, but also it make money when consumers are buying the add-ons. In this case, it will be the apps, mobile apps, right? So Apple's add-on revenue mainly come from two sources. So the first is it comes from the direct revenue from selling what we call the first-party add-ons, Apple's own apps, right? So Apple Music or its cloud gaming service like Apple Arcade. On the other hand, there are a lot of third-party add-ons, right? So like Spotify and Xbox own cloud gaming services that compete with first-party add-ons. And Apple can collect around 30% of commission for all the transactions for the third-party add-ons, including those one-time download payments by consumers, and also including all the in-app transactions by consumers are using the apps. Right? So for those third-party add-ons, of course, they want to evade paying the 30% of commission. So what they want to do in practice is they try to use some external distribution systems. For example, using third-party app stores to deliver their apps, or they use some external payment systems like PayPal for the in-app transactions. So the antitrust problem, the self-preferencing issue happen here is because Apple can leverage its control for the base product and to give itself advantage in the add-on market. And in our paper, we studied two specific of very prevalent examples of self-preference. So the first type is what we call the distribution self-preferencing. Basically, Apple kills the side loading, so require all the third-party add-ons to be distributed through Apple's own app store system. And that allows Apple to charge the 30% commission. And the second type is what we call functionality self-preference. basically Apple will degrade the functionality of the competing third-party add-ons to give advantage to its own first-party add-ons. So a classic example of the distribution self-preferencing is a famous Epic lawsuit, right? So Epic, which is the owner of the very popular game Fortnite, it used to provide the external payment links for consumers to charge their in-app, in-game account. And that made not only Apple, but also Google remove Fortnite from the app stores. And that led to the lawsuit that, I believe, until today is still not fully settled. And this kind of distribution self-preferencing is not only unique to mobile market, but actually in the game console market, Sony was also fined in the UK for preventing third-party retailers from selling digital games. And examples of functionality self-preferencing can include like Spotify, says Apple will repeatedly reject its functionality update so that it won't have competition with Apple Music. Similarly, in the game console market, Sony was fined for damaging third-party PlayStation controllers on their PlayStation devices. And this has, of course, caused a lot of antitrust concerns. And there are many countries and regions have put forward legislations prohibiting both types of self-preference. And that also lead to fines or lawsuits that amount to more than $15 billion of punishment for those big platforms. So for just a concrete example, let's think about the European Union's DMA. And it actually put forth a lot of very detailed requirements that ban both types of distribution self-preferencing and also the functionality self-preferencing. And basically, in most of the economies, the legislations are just simply treating distribution and functionality self-preferencing equally, and they think them just equally bad, and they just put them in one bucket and ban them both. So the question our paper wants to answer is whether this is the right thing to do, whether we should just treat them together or we just should separately treat them and look at them separately. So that leads to our main research question, which is how do those two types of self-preferencing in the add-on market will affect different stakeholders in the market? And also, what are the policy implications we can draw from? So to study this, we developed a game theory model. So I'm just giving a very quick overview of the model, so without telling too much about the details. So basically, there's a platform will decide the base product price and also the selling commission for the third-party add-ons. And then consumers will buy the base product, and the demand end will be realized. And then the third-party developer will decide whether to enter the market or not. So if it chooses not to enter, then the first-party add-on, which will be represented by this right circle, will be monopoly in the add-on market. And the size of the circle measures how many people will find the first-party add-on to be a match to their preference. And in this case, the first-party add-on can charge a monopoly price. And on the other hand, if third-party add-on choose to enter the market, then the red circle first party and the blue circle third party will start price competition. And the size of this overlap between those two circles in this main graph basically captures how strong the competitions are between the two add-ons. And we find when the overlap size represented by this K, number K, increases, the competition will be stronger and the equilibrium profit for both add-ons will go down. Okay. So this is the framework, and how does the two types self-preferencing work in this framework? So for distribution self-preferencing, basically platform will ban side loading, and that means the equilibrium the platform can charge a higher equilibrium commission because it doesn't need to worry about side loading or the competition from the third-party app stores. And on the other hand, for functionality self-preferencing, and basically, the platform can just kill the competing third-party add-ons if it does. And then basically allow the first party to monopolize the market. So in this framework, actually, we analyze the game using backward induction. But what's the central idea we want to illustrate is that in this kind of the add-on market, actually it exists what we call a important feedback loop. Actually, it is technically a positive cross-site network effect between the number of consumers who use the base product, who buy the base product, and also how many third-party developers want to develop the add-ons, right? So this is very simple, right? So more people buy the iPhone, that means more third-party developers will develop the add-ons, and that in turn will drive even more people to buy the base product. So what is important here is that this feedback loop is going to be socially beneficial in terms of increase the consumer surplus and social welfare. However, this feedback loop may not necessarily benefit the platform itself. And that is because when there are more third-party entries caused by this feedback loop, on the one hand, it allows the platform to generate more commission. That's going to be beneficial to the platform. But on the other hand, it just introduces competition to the first-party add-ons. That's going to hurt the platform. So what the platform will do in this case is that it can influence the feedback loop and influence the third-party entry by adjusting its base product pricing behavior. More specifically, if third-party entry is beneficial to a platform, then the platform incentive will be enhance the feedback loop, right? But to enlarge the base product demand to attract more consumers, and that can create a positive feedback for the whole society. On the other hand, if the negative effect of third-party entry is dominating, then the platform wants to shrink the base product demand, and that leads to a smaller kind of a shrinking ecosystem. So with that in mind, then let's look at how will two types of self-preferencing will affect the market. So first, let's look at distribution self-preferencing. Right. So remember, distribution self-preferencing will allow the platform to charge a higher commission because no side loading. And that means now the third-party entries is more likely to benefit the platform because now it can collect more commission. So we show that in equilibrium, what the platform will do is to enlarge the base product demand by charging a lower price for the base product. So now the feedback loop will become stronger, and then that will expand the whole ecosystem of the platform. And eventually, we find that the distribution self-preferencing can increase consumer surplus, can increase platforms' income, and also can be beneficial to social welfare as well. So in other words, the distribution self-preferencing can actually be socially beneficial. All right, so this is the first finding. And what about the functionality self-preferencing? So basically, for functionality self-preferencing, the platform will just kill all those highly competitive add-ons that put a lot of threat to the first-party add-ons. And we find that this possibility creates what we call a commitment issue for the platform. So basically, before consumers buy the base product, the platform would like to promise to not degrade those third-party add-ons because that can increase consumers' willingness to pay for the base product. But after consumers are logged into the ecosystem, and then the platform's incentive shift towards selling their own add-ons. And that will make the platform to degrade a lot of highly competitive third-party add-ons. And consumers will rationally expect this incentive shift by the platform. So in the beginning, they just don't want to buy a lot of base product to begin with. And we show that functionality self-preferencing will reduce the base product demand. And that will result in the weaker feedback loop overall. And that's going to kind of hurt the whole ecosystem. And we show that's going to hurt all parties in the market. And this finding is actually very consistent with some the actual antitrust concerns about Google, right? So Google was known to be an open source system at least 10 years ago. And actually it's complained that Google used an open source to attract consumers. And after it established a critical mass of the Android users, then it shifted to have tighter control of the operating system to limit competition. Okay, so a quick summary, what we find is that the distribution self-preferencing can basically align the platform's incentive to expand the whole feedback loop and expand the whole ecosystem, and that can be social beneficial. On the other hand, the functionality self-preferencing will create this commitment problem that hurt everybody. So the key takeaway of our paper is that the regulations, when they are the policymakers, when they are designing the regulations, they shouldn't treat the two types of self-preferencing equally. Rather, they should separately look at them and design different type of regulations. How much time do I have?
Still have a minute.
Okay, so very quickly about another thing we look at, which is, so we are talking about self-preferencing issue because the platform has the monopoly power in the base product market, right? And that's why in reality, most of the regulations are actually targeting those what we call big techs with significant market power. But the question is, suppose we can introduce enough competition in the base product market. So will competition automatically solve the problem? So we don't need to think about regulation. All we need to do is just to introduce competition in the base product market. And actually, our paper consider an extension of this base product competition. And actually, we find that the competition sometimes can make distribution self-preferencing more harmful to consumers and for the society. And the high-level reason is that so the distribution self-preference's benefit is to incentivize the platform to expand the market, right? But when you have competition, this market expansion by one platform does not fully translate to the actual expansion of the industry demand, because it's sometimes some part of the market expansion by one platform will result in the encroachment of the rivals' demand rather than truly expanding to new consumers. So, the conclusion here is that competition in the base product market can sometimes make self-preferencing even more harmful to consumers. Okay, quickly summarize. So the two types, basically what we find is that distribution self-preferencing and functionality self-preferencing, two totally different type of self-preferencing that warrant very different treatment from policies. And also, the competition between platforms in the base product market can make the self-preferencing issue even worse. So that's all I want to share. So I will keep it to myself.
Let's wait for applause. Yeah, so I'm happy to talk about this paper because I enjoyed reading it very much. So I think as the presentation makes clear, this work has practical relevance as we see in smartphone markets for apps and gaming consoles. Self-preferencing happens, and I think from a policy perspective, this has relevance. Self-preferencing is obviously a concern, as is leveraging one market where there's power into another market where there's competition. And so I think this paper is a very timely and relevant problem. Conceptually, I think what this paper is doing novelly is combining this idea of leveraging and self-preferencing, where a lot of work has already been done, but the idea that there's this network externality on platforms in the form of the feedback loop that Tianxin was talking about in his presentation is the source of novelty. And as this paper suggests, that does create a difference in terms of how self-preferencing acts differently here than in other situations. And so I think this is where the novelty is. Now, what does the paper say? Let me just give you my summary of the paper. At a very high level, functionality self-preferencing and distributional self-preferencing have different strategic implications. So if you prevent sideboarding in the form of distributional self-preferencing, then you recognize that there's this feedback loop the platform can subsidize through the higher commissions that it imposes on these third-party apps by forbidding sideboarding, actually subsidizes an expansion of the handheld side, the phone market. So it gets more people on board, so it has scope to expand the market for the base product. And so that can actually, in this model, have benefits for consumers. Now, third-party apps are always worse off. But this insight is uniquely identified by this paper, which I think is a nice insight. On the functionality side, things are not as rosy. And the problem is it's not rosy for anybody because of this feedback loop. So if you force third-party apps to degrade themselves or adulterate themselves, yeah, the platform's better off later. But if consumers in the base product, if you're going to buy a smartphone of this operating system, you're going to anticipate that they're going to try to leverage that and hurt you, and that's going to hurt the demand for the base product. And so everybody would like to forbid functionality, but as Tianxin pointed out in his presentation, that's difficult to do because they need to be able to commit early on. Now, I want to point out one thing in this model. In this model, the commitment problem arises because of the stark timing where all the consumers decide whether to buy the base product up front, and then they all simultaneously, subsequently enter into the add-on market. And so I think this creates this stark commitment problem that he's identifying. Does that mean it's not a good model? No, it's actually a nice model because it forces us to think about the commitment problem. Would we have the commitment problem if there was gradual adoption? So you have early adopters, middle adopters, late adopters coming in, and they can see for themselves whether the platform is going to force the adulteration of these third-party apps. But I commend the paper for bringing up this issue. And another contribution of this paper, I think, is in recognizing, contrary to the way antitrust policy has been viewed for self-preferencing in add-on markets, is the fact that not all add-ons are the same and they have different antitrust implications. And the big contribution of this paper is in highlighting that vis-a-vis this feedback loop. The two forms of self-preferencing act differently with this feedback. So I want to commend Jane and Xinshin and Tianxin for pointing that out to us. So, well done.
Great. Okay, I think we're ready for our next duo. Is Professor Mario Chess saying that right? Professor KORTEWEG. Anyway, as they're getting seated, I'll start with Professor LECCESE at Boston University Questrom School of Business. Professor LECCESE focuses on the intersection of industrial organization and the economics of innovation. He studies how established incumbents, innovative entrants, and financial intermediaries interact through minority investments and acquisitions, and how these interactions shape both competition and innovation. And then we have as our discussant, Professor Arthur KORTEWEG, here at the USC Marshall School of Business. And Professor KORTEWEG is a financial economist whose research interests include corporate finance, private equity, and alternative assets more generally. In his private equity research, Professor KORTEWEG focuses on investment decisions in alternative asset classes such as venture capital, leverage buyout, real estate, and art. And in his corporate work, he aims to quantify the costs and benefits of leverage and the determinants of corporate capital structures. Tell me about all those things and explain what they all mean. But anyway, I'll turn it over.
I understand.
To Professor Chess.
Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much for the to the organizers for organizing this event and including my paper in the program. I should say this is joint work with Ginger Jean at the University of Maryland, Liad Bakman at RPI, and Yungfei Wang, who is also at Maryland, is a PhD student. And I should also mention this project received financial support from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Okay, so today there is a lot of stuff in this paper. I'm going to give you a high-level overview of what we do. Let me get started with some motivation. You may be familiar with the concerns that have been raised recently regarding the potential anti-competitive effects of serial acquisitions. Serial acquisition is a strategy according to which the same firm may acquire multiple targets in the same or adjacent markets. This concern is in practice exacerbated by the fact that at least some of the deals that form the series may end up being non-reportable to antitrust agencies, and this is because their transaction size is small, or it could be also that merging parties are not large enough. The process according to which a deal is reportable in the US is governed by the HSR Act. In response to these concerns, lately there have been a few policy shifts. For example, the 2023 US merger guidelines include a specific provision targeting addressing serial acquisition. Guideline number 9 explicitly says that when a merger is part of a series of multiple acquisitions, the agencies may examine the whole series. Other countries and jurisdictions adopted similar approaches. For example, Australia. On the slide, you have the EU example. EU, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't have a specific provision for serial acquisitions. However, the DMA, the Digital Market Act, requires gatekeepers to report deals regardless of the transaction size. So this allows agencies to have a window on all the transactions made by this subset of acquirers. On top of that, there were several high-profile cases involving serial acquisitions. We can think of the FTC against Meta with the acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp, DOJ against Google with DoubleClick and AdMeld, and perhaps the most salient case when that comes to everyone's mind when we talk about serial acquisition is the private equity roll-up in the US anesthesiology market, where Welsh Carson, a private equity firm, acquired first USAP, the so-called platform deal, and then through this company, they went ahead and made other add-on acquisition in this market. Now, two out of these three cases that I cherry-picked here concern the tech sector. Today, what we're gonna do is focusing on tech sector, partly because it is at the center of the policy debate, and partly because it's very hard in this sector to identify serial acquisition because it's complex to define markets. So this implies that we have a lack of evidence about this kind of acquisition, and that's exactly what we try to do with this paper, trying to provide the first systematic study of serial acquisitions in the technology sector. So I gave you already a very high-level definition of how we think of serial acquisitions. But let me try and be more precise now. Let's suppose we can define a market. Suppose we see in the green market acquirer 1 acquiring A, B, and C in this chronological order. And in the blue market, we observe acquirer 2 acquiring only firm D. So in this example, in the paper, what we do is defining serial acquisitions as the acquisitions of B and C. It's obvious why D by 2 is not a serial acquisition. For A, we take the agency perspective. So we define that as an initial acquisition. And the reason is that as of the time acquirer 1 acquires A, the agency cannot know whether acquirer 1 will make additional acquisitions in the green market. Okay. So now the big question is how we think about markets in the technology sector. To that end, we leverage a database from Standard & Poor's, which goes from 2010 to 2023. This is a technology M&A database in which each observation is a majority control acquisition. And it focuses on the technology sector in the sense that targets necessarily belong to the tech space, whereas acquirers may belong to any sector of the economy. Now, this is the value of using this database is that it provides us with a unique taxonomy of the technology sector. I say that it's unique because it's extremely granular, and to give you a sense of this granularity, basically, like the database assign each company to a level 1. For example, on the slide you see mobility or internet content and commerce, and a level 2. Within each level 1, there are several level 2. We have about, in the database, we have about 24 level 1 and more than 200 level 2s. Now, this is significantly more granular than traditional industry classifications, for example, NAICS code. So it gives us a lot of flexibility in identifying series in the technology sector. Of course, one may wonder what's the mapping of this technology, how this technology categories effectively map into antitrust market. They may well differ. Of course, we don't really take a stand on this. Rather, what we do is providing evidence that regardless of whether we define a market as a level 1 or as the combination of a level 1, level 2, our results, our qualitative patterns remain robust. That said, to give you a sense, you can see that we can compare like how our taxonomy performs with well-known antitrust case. You can see that AdMeld and DoubleClick belong to the same level 2. So regardless of whether we use level 1 as a market or the combination of a level 1 and level 2, then these two acquisitions would constitute a series. On the other hand, for Instagram and WhatsApp, it's slightly different because they will form a series if we use mobility as a market, but they will not if we were to focus on mobility messaging as our market definition. So this is again the first systematic study of serial acquisitions in the technology sector. So we begin by documenting 4 stylized patterns that emerge from the data. The first thing we find is that serial acquisitions are prevalent. In fact, they account for between 24 and 37% of technology M&As. What we find also is that public corporate acquirers account for the majority of the serial acquisitions in our sample. And this is somewhat in contrast with the narrative arguing the importance of the dominant role of private equity acquirers when it comes to serial acquisition. So we argue that a focus on private equity acquirers would actually miss the big picture here. Not surprisingly, we find that serial acquirers tend to be older and better resourced. We also study the characteristics of targets that are acquired in serial deals, and we find that they tend to be larger, older, and more valuable. Somewhat, the fact that they are more valuable may mitigate concerns regarding the fact that these deals fall below the HSR threshold. But actually, when we compare the deal value with the HSR threshold, we find that about 30% of these serial targets, serial deals, can escape antitrust scrutiny. We then look also at the relationship, the correlation between initiating a series and some acquired outcomes, and we find a positive association with market capitalization and the value of acquirers' patent. Natural question is about like the identity of these serial acquirers. Here you can see the distribution of the number of series for the public corporate acquirers. And you can see that the vast majority of corporate acquirers in our sample actually only engage in one series. However, this distribution has a very long right tail, and I have highlighted a few well-known companies. You can see that the largest serial acquirer is in fact Google with 33 series, but we have all the GAFAM firms here, Apple, Microsoft, and Facebook and Amazon. But they are not alone. There is also IBM and Cisco, suggesting that not only GAFAM firms engage in a large number of serial acquisition. Yet, motivated by this distribution, as well as the policy debate around big tech companies, what we do is investigating whether they exhibit distinctive behaviors. And what we find is that when compared to the average acquirer in our sample, we do find that they are different. They engage more in serial acquisition, they expand more beyond their core categories, and they also disproportionately target younger VC-backed private firms. Now, a natural question is the average acquirer in our sample the right benchmark here? So what we find is in fact that when GAFAM is not the only set of firms that engage in this kind of acquisition, and in fact other large private equity firms as well as other large technology firms exhibit similar behavior. So this points to the fact that limiting enhanced scrutiny to GAFAM alone may in practice overlook other significant sources of cumulative consolidation, and points towards the need of a more systematic approach to identify either serial acquirers, big acquirers, or to flag these series, regardless of the identity of the acquirer. So we try in the second part of the paper to take a step in this direction and take the new merger guideline extremely seriously, and we think of a cumulative approach to the pre-merger notification procedure. So instead of having a deal by deal approach where we compare the value of each deal to the HSR threshold, we compare the cumulative value of the series up to the focal deal with the HSR threshold. Of course, intuitively, what this is going to do is two things. First, potentially expand coverage, providing a window on additional deals that individually would be non-reportable. And second, it could advance the review process of series that already will have eventually an individually reportable deal. So we try to quantify the gains from this approach with a simulation exercise. We can look at how many additional deals the agency would scrutinize with this approach, and also quantify how early series are scrutinized based on how many deals happen in between the two approaches, and how many years before the series is scrutinized. So what we find here is that the real gain from a cumulative approach comes from expanded coverage rather than advancing the review process. To give you some figures in support of this statement, about 12% of serial acquisitions are reviewed under the current rules, the individual approach, and 9% of the GAFAM serial acquisition are reviewed. Switching to the cumulative approach would increase review rates by between 4 and 6 percentage points, and for GAFAM, this number is between 6 and 12 percentage points. By contrast, we find that more than 95% of series with at least one reportable deals have zero-time gap, meaning that there are basically no advantages from in terms of earlier scrutiny from moving from deal by deal individual level approach to the cumulative one. So overall, what's the main takeaway? This kind of exercise seems to suggest that there could be gains from this cumulative approach, and this seems extremely feasible to adopt in practice, especially with the availability of real-time data on mergers like the one that we use, and algorithmic detection systems similar to the one that we adopt. And this could be pretty helpful in flagging consolidation strategy. So there is much more in the paper, but I'll stop here, and I look forward to Arthur's discussion.
Thanks. So thank you to the organizers, Jennifer and Danny and Daniel, for inviting me to discuss this paper. This is a very nice paper. So there's a lot in here. I won't have time to talk about all of it, but I will pick up on some issues. And I'm going to try and keep it very high level. And I believe I have some slides that I may or may not be able to show.
we have the slide person?
Eric?
Okay, well, I'll start. I'll keep talking. Trying to figure this out. So at a high level, this paper really is about two key questions. One is, are serial acquisitions in tech common? How often do we see these things happening? And second of all, are these good or bad? And I'm going to say that in a very vague way, because that invites a lot of questions in terms of good or bad for whom? Is it for the shareholders, for the company itself, for consumers, etc. And of course, by what metric do we mean good or bad? So we're talking about competition, prices, things like that, or innovation. So on the first issue, I'm going to talk a little bit about the definition of serial acquisition. So if we want to measure how common serial acquisitions are, we're going to have to come up with some consistent definition. And I think that's one contribution of this paper, is actually taking a stab at coming up with one consistent definition of this. And according to the paper, a serial acquisition is any series of two or more acquisitions by the same, that's not it. Two or more acquisitions by the same acquirer in the same sector between 2010 and 2023. Now you can take a number of pot shots at this, if you will, as to who is the acquirer, right? If Weibo acquires a company, is it Weibo the acquirer? Is Google the acquirer? How do you define that? And to the author's credit, they do a lot of work to establish robustness of this in the paper. The one thing I will take a bit of a pot shot at is this sample period, right? So in the paper, if you as an acquirer buy a company in 2010 in a particular sector, and then you buy another company 13 years later in 2023, that's considered a series, as my understanding. Now, particularly in tech, we know the marketplace changes quite dramatically, right? So when we look at an acquisition in a particular, even fairly granular definition of a sector in 2010, that might be very different than that same sector in 2023, and it's not obvious that we should consider that a series. Okay, so just to underscore that a bit more, what I did was what we do nowadays, I went up to ChatGPT and I told it to make me a picture of what was the state of tech in 2010 and in 2020. So I said, give me a picture of tech in 2010. You might notice I didn't say please, because my understanding is LLMs are not actually people. So these kind of excessive tokens don't actually do anything except waste money and time and energy. Unlike my mom. So Danny had some stories about his mom this morning. So this will be my contribution to the collection of mom stories. She insists that you should say please and thank you to your prompts. Not because she's a wasteful person by any stretch of the imagination, but she's very concerned that when the AI finally becomes self-aware, that they're going to have a record of who was nice and who was a jerk. So she wants to make sure she's on the nice list. Long story short, when Judgment Day finally comes on, it's going to be a bad day for me. Either way, but I wasn't fishing up for that. Either way. So this is the picture that ChatGPT gave me for the state of tech in 2010, right? So on the top, you see the kind of phones we were all still using. Nokia was still a standalone company all the way till 2014. The iPhone was in existence. It first was released in 2007, the iPhone 1. We were at Model 4 by 2010. The iPad was new. So this was the first Apple tablet that was released in 2010. As we saw earlier today, more than half of us were still using Internet Explorer, et cetera, et cetera. Bitcoin did exist, was released first in 2009. I remember there was a coffee shop in Palo Alto that started quoting prices in both dollars and Bitcoin. I don't know if you could pay in Bitcoin. It was like your cup of coffee was like half a Bitcoin or something like that. Of course, nowadays, if you had to pay the same number of Bitcoin, it would be like a $45,000 cup of coffee. But back then, that was a reasonable price. Either way, This was the state of tech in 2010. This is the state of tech in 2023. Notice I did not tell ChatGPT to make 2010 look all homely and old and traditional, and 2023 looked like the future. It did that all on its own. But of course, we had AI. ChatGPT itself was released in 2022. Facebook changed its name to Meta in 2021, I believe. So the metaverse was all the rage, etc. I think we have a pretty good conception of what tech was 3 years ago. All that to say that an acquisition in mobile in 2010 would have been very different than an acquisition in mobile in 2023. So you might want to consider either convincing the skeptical reader whether those, even the more finely grained definitions of sectors actually are serial acquisitions, even when they're far apart, or maybe limit the time frame and say, well, if these acquisitions take place within a couple of years, I'm considering it a series, and otherwise maybe not. All right. Second point I want to make is then once we have a working definition of serial acquisitions, what is their impact, right? And that should ultimately then inform how do we approach legislation of these things. Do we want to encourage these, or are there some of them at least that we might want to discourage? So the paper documents some correlations between the incidence of serial acquisitions and effects on company market values, innovation in terms of patent values and counts, and market concentration. By and large, market value seems to be higher as is innovation, not much of an effect on market concentration. Here's where things get a little bit hairy because, and the paper is very clear in making this point, that these are correlations, they're not causations, right? So what you ideally might want to do as an economist, we try to look at what is the unobserved alternative, right? So what if that merger or acquisition didn't take place? What would have been the effect of all these outcome variables? But that's very difficult to do because, well, we don't see the unobserved alternative, and it's hard to come up with natural experiments or some kind of randomization or even regression discontinuities where you can try and get a handle on these kind of issues. So certainly not a knock against this paper specifically. This is a broader problem for this literature, but it does have impacts for how we interpret the results here.
So Professor, we just are a little over on time.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to make a concluding.
I'll wrap it up. So one thing I would like to see more of is some more sense of which of these have bigger effects than others. So have some heterogeneity so just to wrap up, very nice paper, very useful evidence on how common these serial acquisitions are. Love to see more on the heterogeneity of those. I'll leave it at that.
That's right. Thank you. Great. Okay, so we have coming up now, we have Professor Mark Tremblay at UNLV Lee Business School. Professor Tremblay focuses on the digital economy and its impact on traditional markets. He analyzes the effects of recent policy measures targeting digital platforms, for instance, sales tax collection, fee transparency, etc. His research includes ongoing projects on home sharing, such as Airbnb, ride sharing, Uber and Lyft, and content creation like YouTube and Patreon, as well as market platforms like Amazon. He additionally serves as the research affiliate at the CES IFO Research Network, a global consortium of leading economists who study and contribute to advancements in the field and related policy. And then our discussant is Tianxin Yan at University of California, Irvine, Mirage School of Business. Professor Nian focuses on social media, online communities, and economies of digital goods. Her prior research has won the Informs Conference on Information Systems and Technology for Best Paper and a WCAI Research Award from Warrington Customer and the Analytics Initiative. So with that, I turn it over to you, Professor Tremblay. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, and I want to thank both Jennifer and Danny for including this paper and for giving me a discussant that's actually also done work on Airbnb. So as a brief kind of high ending, I'm going to talk today about Airbnb cleaning fees and then becoming more transparent. The policy that we use is actually an EU policy, but I will try as I go to relate this to the US policies recently by the FTC in April, as well as I think other policies relating to price transparency that we've seen in other states like Colorado, where they've made rideshare prices transparent. So now if you're in Colorado and you get an Uber or Lyft, you'll also see how much your driver gets as well as the price that you get. And then as we've seen in the state of New York, now these companies are required to say if they're personalizing these prices. So I'll try to relate some of the findings we have to some of these other policies and potentially future policies in this area as I go. But as I said, we're really starting here with the policy we're focusing on. So this is the first one in the top left. In 2019, the EU, so in July 2019, or July 2018, sorry, the EU basically pushed Airbnb to say, look, we had these existing price transparency rules in Europe. So all prices include sales tax there. This is very different from the US. You need to do this with your cleaning fees. There was a bit of a back and forth, and in the end, this ends up going through in January 2019. So that will be like the policy shock that we're focusing on. But this applies more generally to the FTC as well. So in December of 2024, so under the Biden administration, the Biden FTC announced that they're going to be requiring that your ticket masters and other resort fee companies and travel agencies like Airbnb, as well as for us, what's very recent or very important at UNLV is all resorts now have to claim their resorts fees included in the prices. This is all going to happen. And they gave the date of 5 months later, and then this actually did continue to go through under Trump. So this is very much a consumer issue that doesn't appear to be a red and blue issue, which is good for economists because at the end of the day, it's about prices and consumers, and we're all consumers. The two snapshots on the right-hand side are, so this is the same reel. This is a relatively famous content creator who discusses differences between living in the US and living in France. And on the left side, she's describing booking an Airbnb in the US and how you look. The price is $100 a night. You book for 2 nights, and then all of a sudden the price jumps to $550, right? And it's because of the cleaning fee as well as all of Airbnb's fees that are now included. And she gets very frustrated by this. And then she turns to, okay, now I'm living in France. I find a place for $100 a night. I put in 2 nights. Okay, well, how much is it actually going to be? And then my French computer kind of makes fun of me, you stupid American, 100 plus 100 is 200 in Europe anyway. So I speak to this because I think it's also, I think it's relevant in how it's pushed policymakers and economists to think more about pricing transparency in these markets, because there's been a lot of flack and a lot of memes that a lot of these companies have received. But thinking about this now, I try to pay attention to social media in this dimension as much as I can. And we're starting to see this now with digital price tags. So all the grocery stores in Las Vegas now all use digital price tags. They don't use the paper ones anymore. If you Google memes on digital price tags, you'll find someone recording in Walmart as the entire aisle has their prices changing all at the same time, right? So I think there's a world where we're going to see more and more consumer awareness, not just with pricing transparency, but also price changes and how prices are changing, when are prices changing now that they're clearly changing more frequently. So I think there's possibility for future policy changes in that regard. Okay, so kind of back to what we look at. So we look at this policy change by the European Commission. They announced pushing this in July 2018. Goes through in 2019, so we'll kind of use both of those dates when I present some event studies. We kind of have both of them marked because it's not clear which exactly one is the first area of treatment. But what actually happens? So now the cleaning fees are included. And so if you look at the prices on the left, you see that they're higher on the prices on the right. At the same time, kind of below these bold prices, they still had the total for this day. So both of these are the exact same listings in London. The prices on the left is if you're in like the post-treatment group. So this is after the policy goes through. Now the cleaning fee is averaged over these nights. And on the right-hand side, this is before where it's just completely removed from the bold price, but it's still included in the price right below. So we see a clear increase in prices that's very visible, I would say, to the consumers. Okay, so when we first turned to this, we're like, this is great. This is going to be your classic kind of price salient story where what we're going to see is now that there's this policy change, there's less incentive to put a lot of my pricing weight on the cleaning fee part. So now that everyone can see the cleaning fee, I'm not going to be able to dupe consumers into getting kind of tricked for a higher cleaning fee. What's going to happen? Well, sellers are going to adjust and buyers are also going to adjust. So in equilibrium, you would expect to see a shift of less weight on the cleaning fee, more weight on the listing price. This is what we expected to see. There are other papers, I didn't include a literature review, but there are other papers that have looked at this in clear settings and find exactly this. This is kind of the end of the story. This is what we were expecting to see. But in the end, I think what we have kind of resolved in the full story of going through this paper and kind of pounding our heads against the wall for a while is I think that story makes a lot of sense for your ticket masters, for your resorts on the strip, where everyone is a sophisticated price setter. They know consumer behavior. There's very few players in setting prices. They set prices to maximize profits. That's not necessarily the case on Airbnb. And I can speak to this from my own perspective. So before I was at UNLV, I lived in a small college town. And my wife and I rented out our house on Airbnb during graduation because we realized just by looking at Airbnb in this tiny small college town, picking the days for graduation, we could rent out our place for $2,000 a night. So if you think of what our process was as a potential seller, it was looking at Airbnb to see what are the relevant prices for the days. So this policy now is going to change what prices I see. Right now, I'm going to see a higher price. I'm going to see this 226 instead of this 178. And so this is going to make me think prices are higher, allowing me to charge a higher price potentially. So this is the story we're trying to sell with this paper. And I'll hopefully give you enough evidence to convince you that this is what we actually see. Okay, so this is kind of the first piece of evidence of, hey, Airbnb is not Ticketmaster. It's not the Las Vegas Strip. So what am I presenting here? So this is so let me start with the 71. So this is 71% of our sample. Every single month, they have a positive cleaning fee. So, you know, it's over a 2-year period. So our data is over 2 years. I'm consistently every month setting a $100 cleaning fee. It doesn't change, right? Or it's never zero, I should say. The other 27%, these are listings where every single month their cleaning fee is zero. So roughly a little over a quarter of our sample, they never set a positive cleaning fee. It is always zero in every month that they're present. The remaining 2% are somewhere in the middle. So these maybe are people where maybe when I start, I don't realize I can use the cleaning fee. It is a default at the time for Airbnb to set your cleaning fee to zero. So maybe I don't realize I could use this cleaning fee. Then I do realize other people are using it and now I set it positive. So some of the months I'm zero, some of the months I'm positive. Those would be the people in between these 0 and 1, and this is only 2% of the sample. So a very small few people. And for us, this is immediately going to contradict this natural theory of, okay, they're going to shift cleaning fees down and prices up. You can't shift your cleaning fees down if it's at 0. So what do these other people do? What's the partial equilibrium effect on them? And then more broadly, what is the general equilibrium effect on the entire market because they exist in mass? Okay, so getting into the data a little bit, we used 2 years, 2018, 2019, covering Airbnb in the largest city in Europe. So a couple things, London was in Europe at this time, and this is also before COVID. So 2 important caveats. We do extensions on Rome and Paris. There's some issues there in terms of there are other policies going on. And it turns out in Italy, they don't believe in zip codes. So we're having some geography issues with that data. But by and large, we see relatively good results, at least for cleaning fees there. We also do an extension where we compare European cities to New York, and we see some results that also confirm. I'm not going to go too much into these, but we do see, I think, more convincing stuff than just what I'll present this in the presentation. Okay, turning to the policy. So first, we just, we want to make sure cleaning fees do what you expect cleaning fees to do. They should go down. There is a little bit of a econometrics problem here. So the policy was specific to EU IP addresses. So what this means is if I'm interested in the US looking at a place in London, I'm still going to see the 226, even post policy. If I'm in Europe looking in London post policy, I see now I see the, I got this wrong, sorry. If I'm in the US, I will see the lower price. If I'm in Europe, I will see the higher price. So it depends on the location of the consumer, not on the location of the listing. So this creates some problems because all of London is technically treated. How do we deal with this? We use review shares. So basically, if you look across London, some listings are targeting US consumers. They're not going to be treated as much because US consumers are still using the old ways. And there are some listings that see European users more. And so this is how we kind of deal with this issue. We get a more intensity kind of scoring. what do we find? So yeah, we do a bunch of different things. What do we find? So this is the event study. This is where I think it's, in some ways, we're kind of showing, look, these two vertical lines are capturing the two policy points. So the one on the left, this is the July 2018. This is when the EC, or the European Commission, announced they're going to start forcing Airbnb to do this. And then in January 2019 is when it actually started. We presented this actually online to Airbnb. They have like a small economic seminar where they invited us to present. We said, you know, did you do any experiments? And they didn't respond. So we didn't take that as a yes or a no. So I think there's reasons to believe, you know, maybe in the middle there's something going on where you have some partial treatment, not necessarily full treatment. But what I will say is this is a relatively small change in cleaning fees. So I'll turn to the percentage results at the end when I kind of summarize. But we see what you would expect. Cleaning fees go down. Okay, prices. Prices are more complex because, well, we have these two different groups, right? So we're thinking maybe these people that are not using the cleaning fee are now going to see higher prices because they weren't aware of this cleaning fee usage. They might jack their prices up a lot. How do we look at this, or how do we investigate this? So we do two things. One is we just straight up compare what happens if you had a cleaning fee versus not. How do your prices change with this policy? And then we also do another thing, which is we develop a kind of more affordability score. So this is basically doing exactly what I described with my small town experience. I found we find listings that are similar in characteristics and in a similar location, and we compare your prices relative to those to kind of give you an affordability score. It's a continuous measure. And then we compare more affordables to less affordables. The results are fairly consistent between the two, so we're kind of happy with that. Here is so this is the event study for prices. Sorry, I should have labeled this one. This is comparing the more affordables to the less affordables and other types of affordability. And effectively what we're seeing here is, another way to think about this is these are the zero cleaning fee. So what we're seeing is relatively large jumps, especially compared to the change in cleaning fee in this price. So you're seeing relatively small changes by kind of everyone else. And in fact, in aggregate, we don't really see any changes in prices and cleaning fees totaled up. But for this subgroup, you see huge increases in prices. So at the general equilibrium level, it would appear that this policy is not necessarily doing much. At least on the pricing side. Maybe it's making markets more efficient. It's making search easier for consumers. We don't have web traffic data to look at this, but this could be a story that's occurring. But in the partial equilibrium story, we do see some subgroups that are reacting very differently than everyone else. And so in this case, if you actually look at the percentages, so I think this is my last slide, we see very little in terms of levels and percentage changes in cleaning fees. But if we do this comparison of these more affordables or these zero cleaning fee users relative to everyone else, they're increasing their prices by a lot. And in particular, a lot more than the change in the cleaning fees. And in particular, it's actually very close to the amount of this jump in the average nightly cleaning fee being included. So the price increase we're seeing is kind of going from that 175 to that 225. So it would suggest that they really are seeing this total price as higher, and they're responding by increasing their price in response to that. We can't confirm this, but this is kind of what we're suspecting, the story we're trying to tell as we're trying to salvage this project. So yeah, I think that's great.
So before I start, I want to make a quick remark on the AI politeness. So there's a study showing that if you're being too polite or too rude to AI, the results are not good. So if you're being medium polite, that the results usually are more. Okay, so thank you to the authors for this very interesting and a very thoughtful and timely study. I think it speaks to one of the most active debates currently, not just in the US, but also in the EU, about the hidden fee and the junk fees. And the usual pre-assumption is that if there's a price transparency, of course, it's going to help the customers to reduce the search cost, and then it's going to discipline the prices. But however, this study actually, it took so it asks actually a very novel and subtle question, which is what happens when the sellers, not the consumers, are inattentive. So they utilize a very clean and then policy relevant network experiment, which is following the EU pressure. Airbnb started to implement this fee inclusive price upfront for the EU customers, but the non-EU customers still see the lower price, which is exclusive fee. So the setting of Airbnb is ideal because the decentralized pricing on the platform is done by the non-professional sellers, and also the platform design determines the price salience. So to summarize the main finding, after the fee transparency policy, the listings that are used to charge 0 fee actually see an increase in their base price, which is 6 to 7%. The listings that are used to charge the positive cleaning fee actually reduce their cleaning fee by 1 to 5%, although the change is economically moderate. So the effects are immediate and then concentrated among the non-super hosts. So there's a lot to like this paper, and I want to emphasize that how strong the paper is. Methodologically, the results are totally convincing. Especially the authors did a clever construction of the perceived affordability, which is comparing your listing after the fee transparency policy to the nearby neighbor listings. If your other listings are becoming more expensive, then your listing gets looks cheaper, and then that creates an incentive for the host to increase the price. And then the strong DID design, which is very very strong, very well executed, and also they have a lot of robustly checks, which directly speaks to the identification concern that I had in the beginning. And what I like most is that it contributes something new to the literature, which brings the seller inattention into the transparency debates, which hasn't been looked at before in the prior literature. So if I were to wear a light reveal truth hat for a moment, so here are a couple suggestions, and I think maybe alternative approaches that you can take while you are further improving the paper. So first of all, I think the inattention mechanism is the core of the paper. So I would encourage you to refine the inattention measure. So for example, you could use you're assuming that some hosts are not professional hosts. So you're using the superhost as a proxy for that, but you can also use, for example, the year of experience, or maybe hosts with multiple listings. So hosts with multiple listings usually are professional hosts, and they're more attentive to the prices of the nearby competitors. The second is that maybe you can get some direct attention proxy. I know it's hard to get, for example, the web click logs, those kind of data, but maybe you can look at how many times hosts update their listings. The hosts that keep updating their listings, for example, in terms of their profiles or maybe their prices, those hosts maybe are more, they're more aware of the changes in the market, and they're more attention aware. And the second is that in this paper, the author already did a lot to try to disentangle whether this is a learning information treatment effect or this is a demand shift, because it's when the price changes, right? So the demand might also change. So I have two suggestions. One is that the author could maybe exploit the heterogeneity of the guest origin. So you already use that for the cleaning fee analysis, but you could also use it in the base fee analysis. So the idea is that for the non-EU, for the listings that are target, for example, non-EU guests, those listings should not see a big change in the demand because the customers still see pretty much the same price. But for the listings that are target EU guests, the price changes. So if you identify equal increase in the price, then that means that it's not the demand shift, it's probably the information treatment effect. The second approach maybe is that you can utilize the variation in the intensity of the information shock. So the idea is that if there's a bigger information shock, then you might see a bigger response in the host's price reactions. So we could actually compare for example, the zero fee listings that are surrounded by neighbors with a massive deceptive cleaning fees versus the listings that are surrounded by neighbors that are charging moderate cleaning prices. So the shock intensity actually hopefully will change the intensity of the price reaction. So the third point that I have is that one of the issues is that naturally rise is the spatial spillover and the strata so I think the author already speak to that, and they already did some ways to mitigate this issue. So I want to comment on I think this is really good. I think maybe you can do further is, for example, create some buffer zone and then exclude some listings that are, for example, nearby, that are close to the treated listing. The second way is that you can also directly model the spatial exposure and a spillover. So some open questions. So the first one is that how does this price, how do the hosts actually eventually re-optimize? And we all know that on the right, the US, Airbnb implement this all one price globally already. So clearly this policy stays. And then secondly is that, the hotels that are in the data set, so there might be some hotels in the data set. For example, the 27% of listings never charge a cleaning fee. Those could be actually hotels. So maybe you want to take a look at it. The third one is that, we all know how, this matters for Airbnb, but how does this result, maybe could it be replicated on other platforms, which are more centralized? For example, the pricing are done by the platform. And then the welfare effect, I know, the price rise for the consumers and then the search costs fall for the consumers. So what is the net welfare? So maybe some partial equilibrium calculation would be helpful. So some takeaways. So the takeaway is that price transparency doesn't guarantee price reduction, and then the transparency is not a free lunch. And then maybe the regulators should monitor the price responses, along with the implementation of those policies. And I think this paper would travel very well across multiple disciplines, and I really enjoy reading this.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, so the final presentation is consolidation and political influence in the auto retail industry. We first have our presenter is Professor Caitlin Slattery at the University of California, Berkeley Economics, and Professor Slattery's research focuses on the relationship between local governments and private firms. And our discussant will be Professor John Matsusaka here at Marshall, USC Marshall School of Business. And Professor Matsusaka focuses on direct democracy in corporate organization. He publishes on economics, finance, law, and political science. His most recent book is Let the People Rule, How Direct Democracy Can Meet the Populist Challenge. And he's also the executive director of the Initiative and Referendum Institute and consults for the White House Council of Economic Advisors. So with that, Professor Caitlin.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So this is joint work with my colleague Sarah Moshe, who is also at Haas Berkeley with me, and we are interested in consolidation and political influence, which although has been getting more attention in recent years, certainly not a new idea. So here I have a quote from some antitrust scholars on when the antitrust laws were written at the turn of the 20th century. Although they speak of economic concepts, they are partly motivated by the concern that concentrated economic power can lead to concentrated political power, which, their words, is widely seen as unhealthy in a democracy. So the relationship between consolidation in an industry and political influence is empirically very difficult to study. There are many forces that contribute to an association between those two variables. We're going to take a stab at it by taking very much a micro approach, studying one industry, the auto retail industry, and looking at large acquisitions in that industry. So basically what we're going to be able to do is to examine lobbying before and after a large industry acquisition, examining lobbying, and I should say also policy outcomes at the state level. So doing this at the state level provides us with some more nice variation. Now, reading news articles about, worrying about political influence of firms, we're usually thinking about Google, Microsoft, the firms that Mario was talking about in his presentation. This was also, I think, the focus, and if we want to take the historical context, right? The titans of industry, the boss of the Senate, these are the big, railroads, Standard Oil, these type of firms. These are not the firms we're looking at. We're going to be looking at auto dealers again, who are small firms that operate in local markets, right? The thing is they have a lot of market power in these local markets. People buy cars locally. And so we have, again, this segmented industry. So not unlike the work of Tom Woolman, Amanda Stark, and co-authors, we're going to learn a little bit more about market power in local industries. I'm going to show they have product market power, and they're going to actually have considerable political influence in state legislatures, which is where the regulations that they care about are decided. Okay, so before I get into like what we do in the empirical analysis, I want to go through 3 facts about the industry that I want you to have in mind. I'll stay on time because I could talk about this industry for hours. So the first thing is that the industry is experiencing a wave of consolidation, but it is very fragmented, okay? So this figure is showing the share of all the dealerships in the United States that are owned by the top 4 firms between 2001 and 2024, okay? So in 2001, the top 4 firms owned about 500 dealerships in the US, which was 3% of all of the dealerships. Now in 2024, 2 years ago in 2024, they own a little over 1,000 dealerships, so 6% of the total dealerships, okay? So their market share has increased a lot if you look at the starting level, but it's still extremely diffuse industry. However, at the local level, which is where you think you may care, that's where people buy cars, it's not unheard of that the same auto group owns the majority of dealerships. What we're going to do is take advantage of this wave of consolidation. We're going to study large acquisition events in the industry. When I say large, on average, a sample event is like an auto group acquiring 10 dealerships at the state level, okay? This is large in terms of like these events are very rare in the industry. And at the local level, this can be up to 5%, 10% of the dealerships in a metro area, even more at a like town area. So it really kind of depends on the density of the geography. Okay, so this is fact number 1. The second fact is that auto dealers care about policy. Okay, they have significant policy interest. They're actually well known for their influence in state legislatures, such that there are auto dealer specific franchise laws that dictate the relationship between the manufacturer and the dealers. Now, these franchise laws are very favorable to dealers. They have elements such as they restrict entry of new dealerships. They make it very hard to terminate existing licenses for dealerships. I've heard in some states that you basically have to commit felony for your license to be revoked. And then more recently, there's been this interesting policy battle with Tesla, where Tesla's trying to sell direct to consumer in the states, and the dealers would like to block that. Not necessarily because they're worried about Tesla per se, but because this is a threat to their dealer model. Then what if Ford gets to sell direct to consumer, GM gets to sell direct to consumer? They've been quite successful in this. Tesla's happy as well. Basically, in most states, what's happened is if Tesla has been grandfathered in, is able to sell have some stores, but they have pulled up the rug behind them, and the dealers have made the franchise laws even stronger, such that there cannot be more entry. Besides the dealer specific stuff that they lobby on, they're also interested in more general things that you think a small business might be interested in, like employee protections, consumer finance regulation, things, sales tax, things like this. And then the third fact is about the lobbying. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to collect data from state ethics portals on lobbying expenditures. And so most states, just like the federal government, require that lobbyists report who they're working for and how much they're getting paid. So we can collect that from each state that makes that available. And what we see is that individual auto dealer groups, even the very largest ones, rarely lobby on their own. What they do is lobby together with the state trade association. So we see that these state trade associations that represent the interests of the auto dealers in that state basically organize to collect dues from all of the members in the state that may potentially rather free ride on lobbying efforts, and then use those dues to hire lobbyists and send those lobbyists to the legislature and tell them about the dealers' issues. Now, you might think, okay, they've already solved the collective action problem. The thing is, the dues are relatively low. Dues make about like a third of the total revenues that the auto dealer associations collect. And so on top of that, they basically have these voluntary contributions that dealers can make to the association to fund lobbying efforts. Here are just two examples in California and New York. You know, it's very straightforward that the mission of these trade associations is to advocate for the interests of the industry. Okay, so those are the three facts that I want you to have in mind. So we have this industry that's fragmented, but consolidation is growing. They have significant policy interest, and they are already organizing together in this collective to lobby at the state level. Let's move to the empirical strategy. Like I said, it's a pretty straightforward strategy. We're going to take an event study analysis using those large acquisitions I referred to earlier as the event. We're going to have 30 events. We're going to have to study this at the state level, state year level. Why? Because they lobby all together with the trade association. So that's going to be the level of observation at which we observe lobbying. And we are going to examine how lobbying progresses before and after the acquisition event. We're going to have 30 events in our sample, and then we have a set of just over 10 states that never have a large acquisition event. And so those are pure controls. I'll show you now the results for the baseline analysis of, again, auto retail lobbying. On the y-axis is log lobbying, and on the x-axis, the periods since the events. It's a standard event study where we have the Sun and Abraham approach for heterogeneous dynamic effects. You know, it's a bit noisy, but basically what you have is an increase of about 30% in lobbying post-acquisition. Now, 30%, I don't know if I said what the baseline lobbying was before. The baseline is about $250K a year, so 30% is about $75,000 increase in lobbying. This could be more lobbying hours, you're sending your lobbyists more often, or it could be you're hiring a better lobbyist. We can't exactly observe that. Now, the next thing I want to show you is the trade association's revenue. So we collect data on the trade association's finances from their publicly available Form 990s, and we see, consistent with the lobbying results, that the trade associations are collecting more revenues after the acquisition event. We show in the paper this is not driven by an increase in dues, so we think that this is more discretionary contributions to the trade association post-event, though there could be other potential mechanisms. But it's internally consistent with the lobbying results. Okay. The next part of the paper is to try to think about the mechanism. So we have a model in the paper where we lay out the two forces at hand. The first is the market power effect, and I think that's what most of you would have had in mind. The merged firm makes greater profit in the product market, and that increases the return to lobbying, right? But then there's the fact that lobbying is a public good in the industry, so you have an incentive to free ride on the lobbying of your competitors, and you're under-providing it in the industry. So we have the second, what we call the collective action effect, where the merged firm internalizes more of the benefit to lobbying. So we want to try and disentangle these two effects. And our empirical strategy here is to leverage the misalignment between the product market and the political market. So what we're going to do is compare two mergers in the model, but acquisition events really in the data, where both experience increases in product market power, but the geography of acquired dealerships creates variation in the increase in political market power. So, how am I doing on time? Okay, I will walk you through this diagram so that we make sure we're all on the same page. So I have two dealer groups, right? I have dealer group 1, those are the white cars, and dealer group 2, those are the black cars. You can think of a car as a dealership location, okay? And they're operating in these ovals or circles, those are cities. Okay, so those are the product markets. So what's happening? I want you to imagine acquisition dealer group 1 acquires dealer group 2. Now in the panel on the left, both of the product markets that those dealer groups operate in are totally interior to the states, the political market that I care about, right? So increased lobbying at the state legislature in this situation is going to benefit all of the dealerships of this newly merged firm. Okay. Now, what happens in the second panel on the right? All I've changed is I've moved up the border of the adjacent state, right? State B in this case. So now, dealer group 1 acquires dealer group 2. Dealer group 2's dealerships are still located in state A, but they're more exposed to the policies, whether it be consumers or competition in state B. What does that mean in practice? It means that the newly merged firm does not benefit as much as in the first case from lobbying at the state A's legislature. They don't benefit as much from changes in regulation in state A because they're more exposed to state B's policies. I should quick aside that could be like there's more competition over the border. It could also be that the sales tax are higher over the border, and when you buy a car, you have to pay the sales tax of the state that you live in. Okay, so we take that to the data and basically look at events where the product market and political market are perfectly aligned, what we call the interior events in that diagram, with the events where the dealerships I acquired are in those cross-border markets. And what do you see? The results are totally driven by the interior events. That's the figure on the left. Acquisitions that both increase the political and product market power. So both the collective action effect and the market power effect are at play in those results. Okay, so then the second part or the last part of the paper, we link this to policy. I'm going to give this short shrift because I was worried about time. But basically, why do we care about lobbying? If by revealed preference, we'd think that increase in lobbying buys them something in terms of policy. We want to see this is kind of hard to do. One of the benefits of using the state level data is that some states actually require the lobbyists to say exactly which bills they're lobbying and whether they support or oppose it. So basically what we can do with that data is look at how the success of the auto dealer lobby changes after the acquisition event. And what we see is that the industry is more successful. What does that mean? The bills they support are more likely to pass, and the bills that they oppose are more likely to fail. This is we find a pretty large effect, but right now the sample is relatively small. We have 6 states. We have this data, and we're trying to grow it. So it's large but noisy, about like 18 percentage points. Now the last thing I'll say is that these favorable policy outcomes are most likely at the expense of consumers and employees. So to the extent that we can see which issues they're lobbying, I mean, we see the text of the bills and the interest groups that are lobbying against them. It's usually unions and consumer groups rather than the manufacturers. And on that note, I will end. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your comments.
Hey. Slides. Okay, thank you. So this is a paper on a really big and very important question, which has a lot of great attention to detail. There's no way it was a daunting task. There's no way I could do remote justice to this in 5 minutes. So what I decided to do is just pick 3 things to talk about in this time. As I said, this is a big question. Antitrust policy, in some ways, the history of antitrust policy is it had a bunch of notions when it first started being formulated in the late 19th century. One of them was sort of consumers, but I'm not sure that was the central one. There was a lot of concern just about political power being exerted by large corporations. And sort of economists took it over sometime in the 20th century and redefined it to be mostly about prices and consumer surpluses. But we've seen a movement to rethink in some sense, to go back to the underpinnings of the entire idea recently. And this paper is in that tradition. So it's not a tradition, actually. It's in that area. It's not a tradition because it hasn't been looked at, and it's a very hard question to look at. So this paper is quite exciting because they're actually sort of going directly into this question that we've been wondering about. It is an empirical paper. It's an entirely empirical paper. I do empirical work. What what you have to do, for those of you who don't do empirical work, what you have to do with empirical work is to figure out how much you believe it. And the answer should never be 100%. Okay, I've done many empirical papers, and all empirical authors will say you should never believe anything I find. It's never 100% the truth. There's always data decisions you made. There's error in the data. There's all kinds of things. You have reasonable degrees of confidence, but I'm just those of us who do it understand that there's a whole bunch of decisions that have to be made, and we struggle as authors to do it in the most revealing, objective way to sort of find the truth, but it's never 100%. So I'm going to say a few things about this paper in terms of the in terms of the execution. I have some maybe a little bit of thoughts of the way to take it, and in terms of sort of believability here. And again, this is what you say with every paper. This is not a criticism of this paper. You have to make some choices. So there's basically two, I take away as two findings from here. The first one is that following mergers of these auto dealers, there appears to be more lobbying in the state. That's number one. And number two is that following these mergers, there appears to be more favorable legislative outcomes for the industry. So those appear to be the two facts. To my case, the conclusion of the paper is written a bit too strong, saying things like this paper shows that mergers in the auto industry increase industry lobbying. I think it's much more tentative than that. I think there's questions that you could raise. I think I would like to see a lot more words like suggest or some evidence. I would also like to see the caveats listed. I would like to say, and here's the reason you should believe me, here's the reasons you shouldn't. I like conclusions of papers that tell me as a reader what are the limits and what are the things that need to be done. As far as the caveats, I think the main one that I struggle to try to figure out is that the way mergers, what the paper is doing is it's comparing states, finding the year where they had a big merger or big mergers, and comparing that to other years in other states. So the event, if you want to use those languages, is a large merger. But the mergers aren't large in the way that we usually think of them when we do antitrust. When we usually do antitrust, we think about things like market share, okay, or sales. That's not what's happening here. Large means that the actual number of dealers was 5 or 7 instead of 2. We don't know that those dealers were large or small. We don't know really anything about their market shares. So this doesn't make it bad, and there's data limitations. So this is not saying, the author should have done something else, but I do think it's important to recognize that we don't have a conventional measure of market share here, and this isn't the object that we're usually interested in looking at. It also raises the question to me, and this is something that I think could be done. I believe there are data that you could get some sort of concentration types measures for each state, at least top 4. 4 firm concentration ratios and so forth. The underlying question that's motivating this literature is as I understand it, as I think about it, is a question about concentration. There's been a lot of debates about changes in aggregate concentration in the economy, what that might do to our democracy and so forth. It's not about whether particular mergers are doing things, but whether general trends in concentration matter. It should be entirely possible to also do the exact same regressions, but put concentration as an explanatory variable and see if concentration moves things. It's not the same thing, but it's not obviously better, but it's not obviously worse. And I think that having those two things together in the paper will help us get a reading of what we think is the primary thing. If they both point in the same direction, our confidence goes up. If they're telling us different stories, our confidence goes down. But that's okay. We're trying to figure out what's happening here. So that's the main thing I would say. Those of you who read these papers, one has to dwell down into a lot of details because you have to make a lot of decisions as an author in these papers, and one could always second guess those. One would always like to see alternative specifications shown. The more of that you can do better. There's some of that. The more of that. But let me just shift gears to a couple of higher order things that were prompted by this, because again, I think this paper has the great virtue that it's trying to do identification. It's trying to be careful with data, but it's focused on a big question. It's not chipping away at some small thing. The first kind of conceptual question I have with this, and I don't think this is for the authors to change, but I would like to see some ruminations from them on this, is that when we think of concentrations of economic power and the threats that can pose to democracy, we're not thinking about these types of firms at all. Okay? We're not thinking about little dealerships. Okay, we're thinking about Alphabet, we're thinking about Apple. We're thinking about 100 years ago, Standard Oil. We are not thinking about these firms or these types of firms at all. So the question is, to what extent does looking at these little firms in these states tell us anything about the big question? And this is an unknowable answer. We simply don't know because we don't have data on the big firm side. I don't think the author should have to answer that question. For those of you who want jargon, this is an external validity question. Well, it's not jargon. But I do think it would be worth having some rumination, some qualifications on that. It's not totally clear if this is really getting at our question. And finally, I'm going fast because I don't have much time. But finally, the other thing I would like to see more thinking about is lobbying itself. There's a subtle tone to the paper and to the literature that suggests that lobbying is bad. And if businesses lobby and they manage to influence legislation, that's harmful to democracy. And I believe that is not at all obvious, and in fact, it's probably wrong to a large extent. My notion of democracy is one of pluralism. It's that democracy works because all groups are out there and they're making their arguments, and in some way, if there's a level playing field, we get something that reflects the common will. What I care about is a level playing field, not the fact that people have influence. I think if we had a democracy where groups had no influence, that would not be a democracy. That would be some sort of technocracy or something like that. Groups should be able to organize themselves. They should be able to lobby. Lobbying is not necessarily a pernicious thing. It's providing information. It's allowing bills to be calibrated to take into account constituent needs. There's a whole bunch of very good things about lobbying. So we don't know if the laws again, if assuming we take these results as given, we don't know if the lobbying or the laws that were passed that were defeated were good or bad laws. We simply don't know. These could have been, they could have been blocking very terrible distortionary laws that were imposing great deadweight costs in the economy. Or they could have been blocking consumer unfriendly laws. We simply do not know. So without that evidence, though, I think we have to be very, very careful. And again, I think a world where there was no lobbying and there was no ability of any interest groups to speak to officials and try to persuade them that they're making mistakes would be a very bad democracy. So I just want to throw that out as a qualifier there. I think that I got the subtle, it's a subtle issue. It's certainly not their main point, but I think they should think about it from that point of view. These concentrations may be helping things, they may be hurting things. We simply don't know, and I think we should be cautious about that. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we're a little over, but we still have time for our session discussion. Dr. Gupta, who's going to tie all of these exciting ideas, one unifying theme that makes sense of it all.
Thank you, Jay. I'll do my best, knowing full well that I'm standing between everybody and that. So I'll keep it really brief.
It's going to be a boring much. So anyway.
Let's put it in my remarks. But look, I'm an engineer and an economist. I often pretend to be a lawyer. I'm not one. So thank you, Danny, for inviting me anyway. And I thought that given my background coming from the industry and wearing a think tank hat as well, the best contribution would be to think about how do we tie a bow around all of these 4 papers that we just heard about. What are the dots that connect all of them? I think the discussants did a fantastic job of thinking about the empirical strategy and making it more robust and generally what the big picture implications are. So when I take a step back and I think about how that impacts business strategy, how that impacts the way antitrust analysis is being done in the courts and the agencies in the real world, and what policy implications are, these are the few things that come to mind. So very broadly, the 4 papers that we chose in this session are, I think last discussant was saying, is reflecting this shift that we are seeing in antitrust from pure consumer surplus and price effects to other dimensions, in particular, the market power, market structure, market concentration. And when we think about the 4 papers, right, the first one was about self-preferencing. It's more about when we see these big platforms, when they're utilizing tools like self-preferencing, how are they able to or not able to utilize those tools to create a moat around the platforms or the gateways. The second paper was about the serial acquisitions, and that was more related to the question or the concern of, after the moat is created, how do you gain more entrenchment by doing these serial acquisitions and increasing your market power? the third one was about the price effect, especially in this context of a distributed market like Airbnb. So you have the moat, you have the entrenchment. Now, how do we harvest if prices do lead to price transparency can lead to more coordination and increase of prices? I don't know. And then the final one is, even broader question, which is about, consolidation of political power and expansion, and therefore further increasing the market power. Now, having said this, I mean, this is generally the overarching theme. I think that all of those four questions have complexity. That's why we are here. We study these, we think about how to unpack them, because it isn't that straightforward, right? So I just want to talk about all four of them very quickly. Key takeaway, why is it timely and what's the difficulty? So the first one on self-preferencing, I thought it was actually a surprising result that the distribution self-preferencing will always have, could have some consumer benefits and some benefits to others, but the other one, the functionality self-preferencing, would always have negative effects. I hadn't thought about it that way, so I thought that is a surprising result, and it's timely because we are thinking about the DMA in Europe. That's full into effect, and we are thinking about the OAMA legislation in the United States to ask the same question and think about to what extent do we want to contain the self-preferencing. And of course, there is right now a lot of litigation on the ground on both of those kinds of self-preferencing questions. So it allows us to think about some of these questions that you raised in your paper, Tianxin, and your co-authors, on what is it that we should be thinking about in the dimensions for doing the analysis for distribution versus functionality self-preferencing. For me, the difficulty here is the following, right? Like when you think about functionality self-preferencing, which means you have a third-party app, you're running on a platform, and what the platform can do is disadvantage you in a number of ways. It's pretty difficult to analyze. It's pretty difficult to actually identify in the real world. So to me, that's kind of the technical and relates to the economic difficulty of that question. Let me quickly move to the second paper, which was about the serial acquisitions. So I thought, the authors and the discussants did a really good job about, me asking the questions myself of, okay, how do you define the serial acquisitions, show what that looks like? The difficulty, of course, here is the market definition. It's the mapping of these different markets that you define to the antitrust markets and, how fast the market moves. I think the discussant really explained that well. And it's timely because we are thinking about the 2023 merger guideline updates, and there is a lot of acqui-hires that is happening in the AI world in particular that is of interest to a lot of agencies around the world right now, and we don't really have a way of handling those in the antitrust world yet. So the difficulty here that I see is we can use similar antitrust tools to some extent, but not all the way when we are thinking about serial acquisitions rather than pure M&A, right? We think about things like high barrier to entry, large economy of scales that are sometimes pervasive in these kinds of technologies. And that is why, for example, take AI as an example, we see a lot of investments that is happening from the large companies as strategic partnerships with some of the smaller players. And that is necessary because of the intensity of the capital investments that's required and other things like economy of scale, etc. So how do we disentangle that in the serial acquisition context, which is different from M&A? I don't know, and I don't know if it's possible. So that's one big difficulty. The third paper, which was about the hidden fee on peer-to-peer platforms. So to me, the main takeaway is transparency is not the same as price decrease. Interesting, but I think you said it yourself, authors, that the story isn't yet over. I wonder if we keep playing the reel, what happens? Does price competition play out over time and actually reduce the overall prices? And even if it doesn't do that, does it at least level the playing field between the different types of players that are in this disaggregated market, the big hosts, the super hosts, and the smaller hosts of the Airbnbs? And the final paper on the political power and political expansion because of increased market power. That's obviously timely. I mean, right now we know that there's a lot of scrutiny on big tech, on the GAFA companies. There is a lot of political motivation. There are investigations. There have been hearings. There's been a lot of discussion around that. The difficulty here, of course, is that okay, even if we take the premise that market shares increases, how much lobbying power and impact on influencing an outcome, political outcome, consolidation of market power can have. What do we do with that? How do we apply any meaningful tool from the antitrust toolkit to address that? So I would stop here. I think those are sort of the 4 big questions that constantly.
That's great. And we're right at time. So thank you very much. That was great.